At my daughter Julia's wedding, Trevor introduced me to his parents. The annoying foreman we must endure. They laughed until Mrs. Sterling gasped. Aren't you Elias Vance? The man who just bought our company? Sterling Global? Trevor turned pale. And if you're watching this video, tell me where you're from or what time it is for you. Trevor laughed right on schedule and posed questions that kept the spotlight where he wanted it. Right on him, reflecting calculated support. At the half-hour mark, the first Fisher showed. He asked Julia about the young patients who had a hard time following instructions. Consequences, he said, tapping a polished knuckle against the table with unnecessary force. You can't let softness erode standards. My father always said the cold reality teaches better than the warm promise. Julia gave me a quick, uncertain glance. I don't know, Trevor, she said gently. I get better results with patience and reassurance. Patience is a privilege, he said, still smiling. But the smile didn't reach his eyes. Discipline is love when you look at the ledger. I let that sink between us like a drop of corrosive acid in a clean glass. To change the toxic air, I asked him about the food bank volunteering. His chin lifted a single, self-important degree. I set aside the first Saturday every month, he said, as if describing a shareholder meeting. Mentoring young entrepreneurs, listening time on community outreach. I've organized significant donations, too. That's good work, I said, and meant it, if the sincerity outweighed the performance. Do you visit on-off Saturdays if they need someone to cover a shift? He paused just a tick. The hesitation was a tell. The program runs on structure, he said smoothly. People thrive on structure. Volunteers, too. I adhere to the schedule. He gestured toward my frayed shirt cuff, the one Marion's careful stitchwork had finally surrendered to time. Hard work's noble. Elias, he said, his voice laced with the faint contempt of a man who'd never worked with his hands. It grounds a person. I filed the phrasing. Julia tried to tell me about the proposal again, her version full of excitement and sweeping romance. He corrected a detail, small but surgically precise. It was by the stone bridge, not the Riverwalk, he said, smiling at me. The specifics matter. They do, I said. For 20 minutes, he had been impeccable. Attentive to Julia, quick with please and thank you, complimenting the hearty beef stew with the right sort of patronizing restraint. I could see why a busy nurse, focused on healing, would be charmed by his flawless veneer. He laughed on time and posed questions that kept the spotlight where he wanted it, right on him, reflecting support while actually commanding the narrative. He peered at the water pitcher on the simple oak table. You still don't drink? Not much anymore, I replied. He shrugged, the small gesture full of condescension. I brought a bottle, he said, holding up a French red with a label designed to shout its unnecessary cost from across the room. Mind if I open it? I wouldn't want the quality of this vintage to go to waste on the wrong food pairings. A spike of pure, defensive fury hit my chest. He wasn't offering, he was announcing his intent to elevate the meal. To be my guest, Trevor, I said, my voice steady, my anger buried deep behind the foreman's facade. I rose and set 3 wine glasses on the counter, then quietly returned one to the cabinet without looking at him. I watched from the corner of my eye as he focused entirely on the ritual of uncorking the expensive bottle, completely missing the small act of removal. We sat. The stew was tender, the steam rising like a forgotten promise. Trevor asked about my retirement funds. I said I'd kept busy, fixed leaky traps and maintained the yard to keep the house honest. He nodded like a man checking boxes, confirming my poverty. The table, set with Marion's good china, the silver that remembered decades of quiet celebrations, held the tension like a crucible. He drank 2 glasses of the red, his smile becoming slightly looser, slightly more genuine, and therefore slightly more dangerous. Julia, focused only on her joy, didn't see the tiny slips, but I did. Every practiced gesture was a calculated measure of what I was not, and what he was. I realized my test was working. Trevor Sterling was showing me the man he was when he thought the only witness was an old man who didn't count. We ate the hearty beef stew. I kept the iced tea refilled, never touching the French red wine Trevor had opened. He offered to help clear the plates, another checkbox on his performance review. Then he looked genuinely repulsed when the sink, my old, honest sink, shuddered and stuck, the trap clogged with years of grease and use. "Allow me," he said, kneeling and opening the cabinet. He stared at the ancient, knotted pipes like a critic evaluating a disastrous piece of modernist sculpture, then closed the door with a quick click. "You should get someone professional to look at that. Elias," he said, standing a touch too quickly, wiping his hands on a napkin. "Wouldn't want a mess." "I'll manage," I said. He tried again, smoothly shifting the conversation to futures. Their future house, their future neighborhood, their children's future schools. "Riverton Crest," he said, the name dropping with a metallic clang of exclusivity. "The HOA keeps things strictly in line. We don't tolerate sagging garages or wild lawns." "You mean people," Julia said, a small frown line between her eyebrows, trying to turn it into a joke. "You don't do sagging people." He kissed her knuckles with a calculated show of affection. "I do people who try, darling. Success is a choice." If I had been a younger man, I might have argued then and there, letting the CEO in me erupt in a torrent of corporate leverage and cutting truths. But age gives you the strategic patience to collect a full picture. And sometimes, the only way to help someone you love is to step aside and let the cold wind of a man's true nature show them how freezing it really is. We moved to the living room for dessert. I served cobbler the way Marion taught me. Warm blueberries tucked under a sweet, flaky crust. Trevor recounted a Monaco story involving a high-stakes sailing regatta that arrived with a flash of his expensive car key and left with the faint smell of scorekeeping. The practiced laughter he wanted landed mostly. Julia smiled, but her eyes did a small, private thing, a flash of doubt, a tiny withdrawal of her genuine light. I filed it beside the other small, revealing things. When they stood to leave, I pressed a hand to Trevor's shoulder. Not a challenge, not a handshake, just a firm touch of ownership, the way a father blesses a porch after a first date. "Thank you for coming, Trevor," I said. "Of course," he answered, his smile professional. "It's important to make a good impression." "On whom?" I asked, my gaze steady. He didn't pause. "Everyone." After they left, the house sighed back into itself, the silence thick with the residue of my effort. I washed Marion's good plates by hand, soap squeaking against the porcelain, a ritual that turns worry into something you can stack and put away. The clock on the mantel told me I had an hour before the community pharmacy closed. I grabbed my keys and the $20 I'd left in my wallet, not because I didn't have other options. My emergency credit line alone was higher than Trevor's annual bonus, but because a test isn't honest if you peek at the answer key. The fluorescent buzz at Carson's pharmacy always made me feel like a child in a bad photograph. "Evening, Elias," the clerk, a kind young woman named Carla, said, already reaching for the white bag with my name. "2 refills, BP meds, and statin." I handed her my cash. she typed, then blinked, her brow furrowing slightly. It's 46.80. I patted my pockets with a false theatricality, as if a miraculous $10 bill might appear. Hold the statin, I said, injecting a brittle casualness into my voice. Just the BP meds today. No big thing. She set one bag aside. The computer chirped, an electronic accusation. And your supplemental insurance says you're out of network for this month. Elias, she said, genuine concern in her voice. I can call tomorrow to check the flag. Tomorrow's fine, Carla, I said, though I knew tomorrow was not fine. I felt the tiny, ridiculous heat of shame bloom in my ears. The scene was staged, yet the sting of humiliation was utterly real. Back in the car, I sat in the dim light and stared at the small bag in my lap. Deceptions cost, even the good ones. I decided then that tomorrow I'd fix the insurance flag with a single phone call from my private number. But tonight, I'd let the lesson bite. Some truths you only learn by standing in the draft. On the way home, Riverton Crest's elaborate streetlights floated like cold, patient moons. I passed the Marion House retirement residence near the park. In one lit window, a nurse, just a silhouette, straightened a blanket over somebody who taught a shipyard foreman to weld straight in 1968. I pulled to the curb and watched for a minute, thinking about what Trevor called discipline and what Marion called tenderness with a backbone. At home, I made tea and took the one pill I'd paid for. I set Marion's photograph on the arm of my chair so her eyes could keep me honest. He's not a monster, I said to the quiet. He's a map. The question is where it leads. The house hummed in reply. Old furnace, old man, old fears. And I decided two things. I would watch Trevor on his chosen volunteer Saturday, and I would not let my own old pride be the reason Julia learned the hard way. Before bed, I wrote 3 new lines on an index card and slipped it into my wallet beside the 20 that wouldn't last the week. 1. Watch him when no one shiny is watching. 2. Ask about the difficult patient who scares him. 3. The cold teaches, but what exactly does it teach him? Then I stood in the hallway and looked at the closed door to Julia's old room. Quiet, waiting. If I failed, the coming sterling winter wouldn't just take my breath. It would take my grandson's childhood, and I wasn't about to let a man who smiles at frost decide that child's lessons. The first Saturday of the month came in pale and cold, the kind of November light that makes parking lot puddles look like cheap tin. I parked 2 blocks from the Marion House retirement residence so I'd arrive a little winded, appropriate camouflage for a man my age, and took my time along the sidewalk. A nurse on break hugged her cardigan with one hand and a paper cup with the other, steam lifting like a small flag of truce. Inside, the front desk smelled like strong lemon disinfectant and damp winter coats. A laminated sign asked volunteers to sign in. Below it, a fishbowl of name stickers, each blank smile waiting for a name. I printed Elias in the plain block letters that don't invite questions about calligraphy or degrees. Visiting or volunteering? The receptionist asked. Her voice had a night shift velvet to it, the sound of too little sleep. Visiting, I said. Old friend down the hall. A lie with soft edges. The friend existed, but he hadn't met me yet. Down the main corridor, televisions talked to themselves. A game show host blessed everyone with a new appliance. A resident in a lavender robe rolled slowly past me, lips working a silent song, wheels listing a little to port. I corrected her course with a fingertip, and she patted my sleeve like I'd saved her ship from disaster. The activity room sat off the courtyard. Windows fogged at the corners where the room's warmth argued bitterly with the cold outside. Folding tables held checkerboards, decks of cards, and large print paperbacks. A corkboard listed the day's events in bold capital letters. Music hour 10, Wazero, bingo 11, 30, movie Cataloo. At precisely 9:58, a bright, calculating voice announced itself behind me. "Morning!" Trevor Sterling breezed in with 2 cardboard trays of expensive coffee and a smile calibrated to catch every available eye. He wore a designer Henley and a quilted vest that was someone's expensive idea of rugged. Behind him came a young woman in scrubs, all business and bun, arms ready to catch whatever the day dropped. "You're early, Trevor," the woman said, approving, but already busy in her head. "I like to be," Trevor said, setting the coffee on a table like a man laying trophies on display. "Structure helps people thrive." He let that sentence hang a second longer than conversation requires, then turned to the room. "Hi, folks. It's first Saturday, and I promised chess." He brought a roll-up board, unfolded it with a flourish, and began setting the pieces. White pawns lined up like eager recruits, the heavy rooks thumping down with authority in the corners. I stayed by the door and collected the small, revealing things. When the aide, the woman with the bun, reached past Trevor to move a table nearer a heater, he shifted half an inch, just enough that she bumped his shoulder instead of clearing it. He didn't apologize. He looked mildly annoyed she hadn't anticipated the exact pocket of space he needed. The car ride to Riverton Crest was silent, the air thick with the residue of Trevor's self-righteousness. Julia sat rigid, staring out the window, her shame battling the rising tide of protective anger she felt for me. Trevor hummed along to a classical station, completely satisfied with the lesson he'd delivered, oblivious to the chasm he'd just opened. The house in Riverton Crest was vast, cold, and entirely too big for Julia's generous, quiet kindness. It was less a home and more a definitive statement, a monument to wealth governed by a rigid homeowners association agreement that prioritized conformity over life. I walked the echoing hallways, listening to the vast, empty sounds, the way a former CEO listens to the future of a hollowed-out company. Trevor was in his element, listing off the upgrades. Granite, imported slate, 3 zones for climate control. He pointed to a library that could easily hold 2,000 books and laughed, the sound brittle and sharp. "Julia, darling, you can teach your little beggars to read here," he said, intending it as an endearment, a light poke at her profession. Julia flinched. It was a tiny, private movement, a contraction of her soul only a father would spot. The word beggars, so casually tossed out, landed like a shard of glass. I moved silently and put my hand on the back of her neck, a steadying, warm pressure, a connection to a different kind of reality. She didn't move away. She leaned into it for a brief, desperate moment. We drove home in a silence thicker than old wool. The car smelled of the expensive, synthetic air freshener Trevor used, and the silence felt like the true, unstated price of his momentum. Back at my small house, I went to the kitchen and made us tea. Trevor, already settled, started a fireplace app on his phone, a picture of a glowing hearth that looked more real than my well-used woodpile. He didn't offer to help with the tea. He was too busy resuming his lecture, still defending his philosophy, needing to win the argument he'd created at the hardware store. "You have to show the world where the boundary is. Elias," he began, his voice calm, pedagogical. "If you give $40 to bypass a system error, they'll ask for 40,000 later. You have to teach them the cost of disorder." I agree on consequences. Trevor, I said, pouring my own cup, watching the steam rise in a fragile plume. I just prefer mine to land squarely on the person who actually made the mistake, not the one who asked for $40 worth of help. The bank made the mistake, he shot back, too quickly, defensive. You don't reward the bank's sloppy coding by bypassing the system. That's weak. The bank made a mistake on paper, I corrected gently, setting down his cup with care. The consequence in the real world was Tony not selling a piece of safety equipment. The principle you were defending cost someone a carbon monoxide detector. He leaned back, the smile still in place, but his eyes were calculating, searching for the rhetorical trap. That's semantics. Elias, the detector would have saved your life, not Tony's. It's your responsibility. Is it? I asked, my voice flat, refusing to accept his reframing. I fixed the system already. I went to a different store after you left. Took me 5 minutes and cost me $42. Not a problem for me. The problem is, I watched a man I trust to love my daughter refuse to spend $40 to correct an inconvenience, because he valued the lesson more than the help. Julia moved for the first time in 10 minutes. She set her cup down hard enough to clatter the saucer, her face pale. It was just $40. Trevor, she said, her voice shaking slightly, using his name like a stranger's. It's not about the money. Julia, he snapped, the veneer finally cracking, the anger pouring out. It's about the integrity of the system. You think I don't see what's happening? You think I don't know your dad is trying to test me? He stood up, towering over the room, the expensive sweater suddenly looking like a thin costume. The charm had utterly vanished. You're trying to prove I'm a bad guy because my family made money and yours. He stopped himself, catching the insult mid-air, but the poison had already landed. Because my family is what? Trevor? I asked, standing up myself. I was 72 years old, but I was not tired. My anger was colder, deeper, and controlled by decades of high-stakes corporate warfare. Because my family saves pickle jars? You're right. We do. Because we value what's inside them. The food, the memories, the necessity, more than the container. This is ridiculous, he yelled, throwing his hands up in a gesture of pure frustration. You know what? You hate me because you think I'm going to take her away. But you already did that yourself. You drove her away with your constant criticism of her choices. Julia took a step back from him. Her initial shame for me had evaporated, replaced by a devastating clarity. Dad didn't drive me away. Trevor. He challenged a choice I made before I committed to it. You are questioning my love for him over $40 and a carbon monoxide detector. And I'm questioning your common sense, he shot back, his face crimson. This whole day was a performance orchestrated by your father to make me look small. You looked small because you prioritized a principle over a person, Julia said, her voice rising to a pitch I'd never heard, full of the righteous fire I'd always loved in her. The system is there to help people, not to teach them a lesson in poverty. He threw his hands up in a gesture of final surrender. Fine. You want the $40? Here. He pulled out his wallet, a thick fold of cash, and slammed 2 $20 bills on the table, right next to the silent phone displaying his fireplace app. Lesson taught? System satisfied? Now can we please talk about the house that doesn't smell like old man and regrets? Julia stared at the money, then at him, then at me, her father, standing quietly, giving her no instruction, no guidance, only presence. And her choice, The choice I had feared she would be forced to make for months was made not in a burst of fresh anger, but in a profound, devastating sadness. "Get out, Trevor," she whispered, the words hitting the stillness with shocking force. "What?" And I said, "Get out. You and your system and your lessons. You can teach your structure to someone else." He tried to touch her, the hand automatically going for her wrist again. "Julia, I love you. I need you to see the big picture. We are better together." "The big picture is $40. Trevor, get out." He paused, registering the finality in her voice, and stalked out the front door, the expensive fireplace app still burning uselessly on his phone, which he'd left on my counter. The sound of his luxury sedan peeling out on the street was the loudest sound I'd heard all year. The front door closed, not with a slam of anger, but with a quiet click of finality. Julia stood there, trembling, looking at the 2 wrinkled 20s on the table. I walked to the mantel and picked up Marion's photograph. I turned to Julia, who was staring blankly at the money, her dream shattered. "I'm sorry, honey," I said, my voice thick with vulnerable forgiveness, the only kind of love that mattered now. "I'm sorry I made you fight that way." She looked up at me, the tears starting to track silent paths through the dust of the day's conflict. "It wasn't the $40, Dad," she managed, her voice cracking. "It was the beggars. And the lesson. I don't want to live with a man who thinks kindness is a weakness in the system." I put the photograph down. I didn't rush to hold her. I simply stood there, solid, real. After a moment, she walked into my arms, the embrace not one of a daughter seeking comfort, but one of a woman recognizing a safe harbor. The house hummed around us, quiet and warm. The fireplace app on Trevor's abandoned phone winked out, plunging the counter into silent darkness. I picked up the 220s, crumpled them into a ball, and tossed them into the trash bin beneath the sink. The old sink, the one he said needed fixing. The system was now truly broken. "What do we do now?" she whispered into my shoulder. "We make tea," I said gently. "And we call your mother's friend, the lawyer. We start with small, practical things, and we build from there. You are safe here, Julia, always." I had shown him the map of his own coldness, and he had followed it perfectly. Now, I would start building a new house for my daughter, one made of the things that money could not buy and principle could not destroy. I paid for the detector and the filters. I then bought a second detector for the Marion House supply closet on the quiet condition that no one ever mentioned my name, and I left a 20 for the staff coffee can because I believe in softening the edges of small humiliations where I can. The true purpose wasn't to correct Trevor's lesson, but to clean up the collateral damage his lesson caused. I drove to Riverton Crest. The open house looked exactly like every other house in a zip code defined by its exclusivity. It smelled of industrial-strength polish and a faint, phony scent designed to suggest freshly baked cookies and the non-existence of pets. A broker whose smile reached every corner of the room like good, thick paint greeted me. Strangers wandered through, silently judging a life by the state of someone else's baseboards. Julia wandered with her hands clasped behind her back, the posture of a student promising to touch nothing and absorb everything. Trevor was in his element. He spoke the language of comps and tax millage without being asked, holding court in a master bedroom the size of my entire house, a room that felt like a promise he was already claiming. "The walk-in closet is entirely separate, Julia," Trevor was saying, gesturing to a cavernous space. "His and hers, essential for maintaining harmony. And this, of course, will be the nursery." He tapped a wall. The acoustics are perfect, I noted, stepping into the room. Trevor was startled to see me. He hadn't heard me approach. Elias, you made it. Did you get your banking system sorted out? I did, I said. Turns out the system was the problem, not the user. Funny how that works. I let the slight sarcasm hang there. Julia gave me a tiny, grateful smile. Trevor, however, ignored the jab and returned to his performance. As I was saying, the nursery is key. We'll send the boy to Riverton Academy. Naturally. They have excellent discipline standards. Julia's posture tightened. We talked about that. Trevor, I want him to go to the Oak Bend Elementary School where I nurse. It's warm, it's integrated, and it's excellent. Oak Bend is fine for working, darling, but it's not the environment for raising a sterling, Trevor countered, the words patronizing and dismissive. It lacks structure. It lacks the necessary momentum. Besides, once the boy starts school, you'll be done working. Anyway. This was the crack, the deep, fault-line fracture I'd been waiting for. Julia turned to him. The fear I had seen earlier now burned away by outrage. Excuse me? It's common sense, Trevor said, his voice rising in volume as his patience dropped. Sterlings don't have wives who work with beggars. Julia, your ward is full of distractions. You'll transition to managing our charitable foundation. It's better for our brand, more aligned with our structure. The word beggars, the same casual cruelty he had used against me at his parents' dinner, came out clean and sharp. It wasn't about the job, it was about control over her identity. Julia took 2 full steps back from him, her hand going to her throat, not to ward off an attack, but to keep the sick feeling down. I am an excellent nurse. I love my job. I love those kids. You don't get to decide what I do with my life. Trevor. I get to decide what's best for our family unit, Trevor stated, completely missing the look of horror on her face. You are being emotional. This is the difference between a system and a sentiment. Julia, you need to grow up and see the momentum of this opportunity. The look Julia gave me was one of pure, wounded resignation. She didn't need me to fight for her. She needed me to be the safe floor beneath her feet. I stepped forward, putting myself between Julia and Trevor. I looked at Trevor Sterling, not as the retired foreman Elias Cole, but as Henry Vance, a man who had bought and sold men like Trevor's father. You're done, Trevor, I said, my voice low and utterly devoid of emotion, the tone I used when a merger had failed and the cleanup was immediate. Done with what? Henry? Trevor scoffed, crossing his arms. Done with your petty tests? I passed. I showed discipline. Julia, tell your father he is jeopardizing our momentum. Julia walked past me, her body brushing my shoulder in a silent acknowledgement. She walked right up to Trevor Sterling and looked him in the eye. There is no our momentum. Trevor, there's no our family unit. There is only my decision, she said, her voice shaking but firm. The engagement is over. Get out of my life. Trevor's face went from crimson anger to a shocking white. His control failed him entirely. You can't be serious. Over a detector? Over a word? You're letting your father break us up over $40? No, Julia said, the simple truth devastating him. I'm breaking us up because you showed me that you value the lesson more than you value me. I'm breaking us up because I saw my future in that hardware store, cold, efficient, and alone. Now get out of my sight. He sputtered, reaching for her. You will regret this. I am a sterling. You will lose everything. I placed my hand on the back of his neck, the same gesture I had given Julia for comfort, but for him, it was a firm promise of consequence. He froze. "You have 5 minutes to leave the premises. Trevor," I said, leaning in so only he could hear. "Your phone is on my counter. Your ring is being couriered to Sterling Global's headquarters. Your next communication, should you attempt one, will be with Sarah Peterson, my attorney. And I promise you, Trevor, you do not want to negotiate anything with Vance Dynamics' general counsel. Now go. You've had your lesson." I pushed him, not hard, but with enough authority to break his trance. He stumbled back, his handsome face contorted in shock, recognition, and raw, impotent fury. He glanced from me to the broker, whose practiced smile had finally dissolved. Then he turned and sprinted out of the room, through the front door, and into his expensive car. Julia stood there, leaning against the cold wall, tears now streaming down her face, tears of relief and exhaustion, not heartbreak. The broker quickly materialized, his voice laced with false concern. "Is everything all right, sir?" "Perfectly," I said, slipping him $100 bill. "Just a clerical error being sorted out. The house is lovely. We'll be going now." After the lesson, before the storm, we drove home in my old pickup, the silence finally clean. Julia held her phone, not calling anyone, but simply holding it like a connection to a lifeline she had almost let go of. Back in the kitchen, I picked up Trevor's abandoned phone. The fireplace app had long timed out. I sent a simple text to his attorney contacts. "The engagement is off. All further communication will go through my attorney, Sarah Peterson. The phone and other belongings will be couriered to Sterling Global's HQ tomorrow." I handed the phone to Julia. "Your last official act, honey." She took it, looked at the smooth, expensive metal, and pressed factory reset. It was a profound, satisfying act of cleansing. She put the phone on the counter next to the 2 crumpled 20s. "I'm sorry, Dad," she whispered, collapsing into my arms. "I'm so sorry I wasted your time on a man who needed an instruction manual for humanity." "You're safe, Julia," I said, holding her tight. "That's all that matters. You chose mercy over momentum. That is a win." I picked up the 220s, the evidence of his arrogance, and tossed them into the trash bin beneath the sink, the old sink he had deemed unworthy of his time. "What do we do now?" she whispered into my shoulder. "We make tea," I said gently. "And we call Marion's friend, Sarah. We start with small, practical things, and we build from there. You are safe here, Julia, always." I put her on the couch with a thick Marion knit blanket. Then I went to my study. I wrote a final entry on my index card. 5. He will not accept failure. He will come. Be ready. I looked at Marion's photograph on the mantel. She smiled her defiant smile. I knew what was coming. Trevor Sterling would soon learn that the former foreman who saved pickle jars was also the man who owned the debt on his father's company. He would learn that control is only effective when you have the leverage, and I had all of it. But the leverage wasn't for revenge. It was for protection. I would build an unassailable wall around my daughter and my future grandson, a wall made not of granite or imported slate, but of unflinching warmth and absolute security. The game wasn't over. The true defense had just begun. He stood at the window, hands in the pockets of his expensive trousers, and watched a boy in a puffy coat ride a scooter down the perfectly manicured sidewalk. "HOA here keeps things neat," Chase said, his voice flat with approval. "It's good for families. It sets a standard. It's good for appearances, I said mildly, leaning against the doorframe, still trying to get the taste of his earlier arrogance out of my mouth. Its appearances protect value. Elias, he countered, correcting me with a smile that was all tooth and no warmth. When he turned from the window, his face had the faraway look of a man seeing a portfolio where other people saw a street. We don't have to like the rules to benefit from them. That's the core of a functioning system. Grace looked from him to me, her face pale, silently begging us not to turn a stranger's beige master bedroom into a debate hall. I smiled at a decorative model boat on a shelf and said, "Some rules save lives." I patted my pocket where the receipt for the carbon monoxide detector now resided. She took my arm, thankful for the diversion, and pulled me into the hallway to show me a linen closet with real, solid shelves. "Dad," she whispered, making me feel as though houses were forts again, and she needed a second pair of eyes to confirm that this particular fort was worth defending. By the time we got back to the car, Chase had already set the GPS to a second listing, then a third. He worked weekends the way some men work weekdays, like a treadmill he couldn't step off without admitting defeat. I made my excuses after the second house, citing the need for an early start Monday, and left them to it. The ride home was quiet, save for the rhythmic whir of my wipers, cleansing the windshield of the day's debris. Monday, I did the kind of work that leaves no fingerprints. At the county recorder's office, I requested what was public and kept my face as neutral as the clerk's rubber stamp. Permits, property filings, and liens that spoke in two distinct languages, English for the headlines and money for the subtext. A shell company named Walker LLC, a familiar placeholder name used by many large investment groups, had snapped up properties after foreclosures in the last recession. The process was legal, certainly savvy, and cold as the bottom step of a basement. By 6:20 a.m., a civil suit sat under a docket number with a seal on the settlement. Another paper trailed a charity gala to a tax-advantaged donation that successfully rearranged the story of a gut-punched neighborhood. None of it was criminal, or even unusual in the world of high finance. But if you held the stack of pages at arm's length, a distinct map began to resolve. Acquire, rehab, polish the narrative, and send the bill for the new story to the people who have to live in it. At the clerk's counter, the copy machine juddered, faithful and bored, and spit out my pages. I took them and left. Outside, the wind had sharpened. A weatherman on a pharmacy TV, muted, all teeth, pointed at a blue band crawling across a map. I didn't need him. My niece, who worked for the National Weather Service, had texted me last night. At home, I clipped the papers into a manila folder and wrote Walker Public on the tab. In my head, I wrote, Walker Human. Then I called Ms. Osorio at the Marion House. "There will be blankets in your lobby tomorrow," I told her when she came on the line. "And lotion that smells like nothing at all. Just a simple delivery." "Thank you," she said, with the total absence of surprise reserved for people who deliver without announcing themselves twice. She knew who I was, and she knew the difference between a promise and a performance. The pinch at the hardware store, if it had worked at all, wouldn't show up in a ledger. It would show up between two people in a car. It arrived that night, a single text from Grace. "Dinner. Just me. He's at a thing." I said yes, and set the pot roast on low to teach the house patience. When she came in, she hugged me longer than she had on Sunday. When she finally let go, there was a crease between her brows, like a careful pencil mark. "You okay?" I asked. "Fine," she said. The automatic fine that means, "Please set the table and don't pry." I need to talk when I'm ready. We ate with the easy, comfortable talk that grows over years, a conversational language full of shared history and shorthand. After the last bite of dessert, the words finally surfaced. "About yesterday," she said. "At the store." I nodded, waiting. Chase said you were teaching the bank a lesson by walking away," she continued, her eyes fixed on a spot on the tablecloth. "He said that's how systems learn." "I was trying to buy a detector," I corrected gently. "Sometimes the lesson is simply that your father makes mistakes and needs a hand now and then." She smiled, a little watery, then bit her lip. "He didn't let me pay." I noticed. He said, "Families need boundaries." I finished for her. She looked down at her hands, turning the engagement ring, the one he hadn't put there yet, on her finger. "Is that true? Do families need boundaries?" "Some boundaries keep water out," I said. "They protect a foundation. Some boundaries keep warmth from getting in. It's an architecture problem more than a moral one." She laughed, the sound soft, a little watery. "Your metaphors are getting worse with age, Dad." "Age improves metaphors the way it improves soup," I countered. "It just doesn't improve men as reliably." She took that in. "He Venmo'd me $40 later," she said, picking up her fork and drawing small, careful circles on the plate. He captioned it, "For Dad, so we don't set a precedent." I felt a small, low heat in my chest that wasn't anger exactly. It was the body's way of saying, "Pay attention." "Did you send it to me?" "No," she said. "It felt like paying you would make the point he wanted to make, instead of the one I wanted to make." "What point did you want to make?" "That I love you, and I buy you a smoke alarm without a footnote," she said. And for a second, her face was 7 years old again, showing me a frog that lived 2 days in a mayonnaise jar before we set it free. We cleared the dishes in that companionable silence people mistake for absence. Before she left, I pressed the second carbon monoxide detector into her hands. "For your place," I said. "No footnote." She hugged me, a long, decisive hug. "Thanks, Dad." After she drove off, I took out my index card and added 2 more lines. 5. When money enters the room, watch which way the warmth moves. 6. Protect channels. I drove to the all-night store and bought a pay-as-you-go flip phone. It was an old model, anonymous and hard to track. I programmed 2 numbers, mine and Ms. Osorio's. Then I put it, charged and silent, in Grace's glove compartment under the registration. It wasn't espionage. It was a door that didn't lock from the outside. A secure, silent channel she could use if the pressure system Chase was building became too much. Tuesday morning, the blankets and lotion arrived at the Marion house where I said they would. Wednesday, the Walker public folder grew fatter with the kind of paper that can't shout but can hum when the wind hits it. I wasn't compiling a criminal case. I was compiling a conscience, in case someone borrowed mine. I added notes from what you couldn't photocopy. Sunday's slice of bread, the hardware store wrist, the way he said boundaries like a synonym for affection. Thursday night, the weather changed its voice. Even the house heard it, the old wood listening down its bones. Grace texted a picture of her school's playground under a sky the color of aluminum. "They say ice by morning," she wrote. "We'll be fine." A minute later, a text from Chase. "Tell your dad we should drive downstate Friday for my parents' thing. Roads will be terrible. He says it's good practice." Good practice. I sat with the phrase, the way you sit with a thorn you're evaluating whether to pull now or let fester to prove a point. I wrote 1 more line on my card. 7. When weather says stop, listen to weather. Then I circled the entire phrase midpoint without writing the word, because you don't call storms by name if you can help it. On Friday, I put salt in the trunk and a heavy Lillian knit blanket in the back seat. I filled a thermos with strong coffee and another with thick soup, and told Lillian's picture I was done with paper for a minute. Paper tells you where the river runs. Cold tells you how fast. The map I'd been drawing had lines enough. Now I needed to see whether the man who loved my daughter could read a sky. By dawn, the town had a clear coat. The trees wore glass sleeves. The world looked beautiful, improved, and utterly unwalkable. My phone did its morning chorus. Amber alerts of a different, localized kind. School closures slid across the screen one by one until Grace's district joined the chorus. She texted 3 minutes later, "School's closed. We'll probably leave at noon anyway. Roads treated by then. Chase says it's good to keep the plan." I set the kettle on and watched the back steps glaze over between clicks of the burner. The system was holding its course, straight into the storm. Weather, like grief, moves at its own pace and asks you not to pretend otherwise. I called her. "Hold off a day. Grace, let the salt work. We promised his parents, Dad, they're doing a dinner. Nothing fancy. Just family. Family can eat leftovers without you," I said, my voice hardening slightly. Ice can't be argued with. He says the interstate's always fine. They salt those first. "True," I said, "about the first 10 miles. Then there's a bridge no one remembers to fear until they do. You know the one." She laughed, unpersuaded. "You and your bridges. Me and my survivors," I said. After we hung up, I went down to the basement and pulled the bin marked winter from the shelf. Rock salt, a battered ice scraper with half its teeth, 2 thick blankets that remembered Lillian's lap. I filled a thermos with coffee and another with chicken soup, and put everything into the Buick like a father preparing for an apocalypse no one else had RSVP'd to. Then I drove to Grace's apartment to be, as Lillian used to say, inconveniently helpful. The lot outside her building looked like a skating rink built by a budget committee, patchy, treacherous, pretending at safety with a handful of sand. Grace met me at the door, her hair tucked into a knit hat, her cheeks pinked by weather and resolve. "You're sweet," she said, hugging me, the hug a little too tight, a silent plea for me to approve of her decision. "We'll call when we get there." "Or," I said, stepping into the kitchen, already setting the thermos down, "you could just not go." She sighed, the sound of a kind person strung between 2 clocks. "I don't want to start off with his mom thinking I'm fragile." "Refusing stupidity isn't fragility," I said. "It's coordination." Chase came in 2 minutes later, the weather on his coat and confidence in his step. He kissed Grace, nodded at me like a man at a podium acknowledging a colleague, and took the scarf from her hands to rewrap it with a neat, proprietary satisfaction in fixing what wasn't broken. "Route's clear," he said, tapping his phone. "And dot cams look wet, not icy." "Cameras can't feel black ice," I said, pouring coffee into my own thermos. "Tires can." "Our tires are all season," he said, cheerful, already winning the argument in his head. "We'll go slow." "Slow doesn't help when you're sliding," I countered. He smiled at me the way polite people smile at a stubborn old man. "With respect, Henry, fear culture teaches the wrong lesson. If we stay home every time a weatherman makes a chart, we raise kids who can't drive in drizzle." "I raised one who can read a sky," I said. Grace put a gloved hand on both of our forearms, the peace move of a teacher. "We'll take it easy," she said to me. "We'll text you at the county line." I hate ultimatums because they make losing a requirement. So, I tried one more soft angle. Give it an hour, I said. Let the salt do what salt does. I'll make pancakes. Structure matters, Chase said gently to Grace, like a coach to a star player. We said noon. Noon. She looked at me with apology, and at him with a residual love I found heartbreaking. My bag's in the hall, I said. I'm walking you to the car. Outside, the lot puckered under our feet. I spread salt in ragged stripes while Chase warmed the car, the exhaust making a small fog machine of principle. A delivery van came around the corner too confidently, broke into a slow, comedic skid, and nudged a snow pile with the sound of a man wearing the wrong shoes. No one was hurt. Everyone laughed, the nervous, shared laugh of people who just saw the edge of a cliff. Chase watched, unimpressed. See, he was careless. And we, I said, spreading a final, necessary stripe of salt, are mortal. We loaded the trunk. Overnight bags, a garment bag so white it looked like a threat, my 2 thermoses, the blankets. I gave my daughter a hug, meant to say 5 things. When I let go, Chase reached for her keys. She'd drive because equality was one of his favorite brands, and he led the way to the driver's door. Grace, I said. She turned, heard something in my voice, hesitated a centimeter. It was not enough. Chase slid into the passenger seat and gave me the smile people reserve for ushers. We'll call you from the road. He had the wrong instinct, which is to prove a point by moving. He had the wrong car for the day, which is any car with tires that think November is May. He had the wrong audience, which was me. The wheels chirped, a bird under glass. Grace eased the car into the lane. Hairline throttle, perfect student. 50 feet, then a patch of parking lot shadow where the sun didn't negotiate, and the tires gave up what little democracy they had. The rear drifted, lazy, sudden. Grace corrected. Light hands, good training. The car answered with the bored malice of physics and spun a quarter turn, then half, then kissed the curb with a cork pop thud. The air filled with the sound that comes after. Almost nothing, like the room had missed a beat. I moved before the brake lights stopped pulsing. At Grace's door, I tapped the glass, and she lowered it with that hush windows make in winter. Her face was steady, but her knuckles had learned new colors against the steering wheel. You okay? I asked. Fine, she said, automatic. And then, after a breath, I'm startled. Chase's jaw had a new, sharp angle. She overcorrected, he said, as if narrating footage for a jury. She reacted, I said, looking not at him, but at the ice. It was a gentle slide, he insisted. We can go. He reached past Grace for the gear shift, like a man reaching for a lever at a factory. My hand met his and didn't move. I wasn't rough. I was iron. Stop! Grace looked from one of us to the other, the space between good men filling with bad weather. Henry, Chase said, his voice sweet with warning. You're escalating. I'm intervening, I corrected. Something old and ungentle rose in me. The part that used to look across a table at a man lying about a thing that would wreck 300 people's mortgages and say quietly, no. I stepped back, walked around to the passenger side, opened the door, and looked at Chase until he had to meet my eyes. I won't be the father who let you take her onto I-84 today, I said. You can resent me for it. You can call me names for it. You can write a family newsletter about boundaries for it. You cannot have my daughter on that bridge. He smiled, the way men smile when there are witnesses. You don't get a vote, Henry. I pay for my votes, I said. And I'm paying now with whatever it costs to be the bad guy. He leaned in, softer. Soft is when you should listen hardest. Grace, he said, without looking at me. We promised. She put her palm on the steering wheel and stared at the frozen arc her tire had traced. My dad's right, she said quietly. He blinked, a small freeze of his own. About what? About waiting. About the bridge. She looked at me, apology and relief in the same expression, and I felt something knot behind my ribs. Chase's smile adjusted like a thermostat forced down a degree. We can practice, he said. We can drive the back roads until you feel ready. No, she said, with a tone I hadn't heard since she was 15 and done being polite to a foolish boy. We can practice tomorrow. The temperature in the car dropped another 10 degrees. Chase stared through the windshield as if the lot had personally insulted him. Then he turned and took Grace's wrist with 2 fingers, the same 2 that had pinched Mr. Woe King's pulse, and pressed just a little, like he was checking time. Don't backslide, he said. See, momentum matters. The glove in my hand creaked. I didn't think. I reached in and touched his hand, 1 finger against 1 tendon, a pressure used by old carpenters to release a stuck hinge. His grip opened because anybody's will if you know where to press. I didn't raise my voice. Get out. He laughed. Excuse me? Get out, I repeated, and he saw then that the pleasant old man had been replaced by someone I hadn't been in years. We're done pretending the weather is a character flaw. He didn't move. He measured. He found the edges of the room with his eyes and calculated the loss. Then he got out because there is a way a daughter looks at you that tells you whether you're losing the next 5 minutes or the next 5 years. And he had just seen it. Grace stepped into my arms, stiff and shaking like a person who'd tried to hold herself together long enough to make someone else comfortable. I'm sorry, she whispered. You're safe, I answered into her hat. We walked them both back inside, Grace beside me, Chase 4 paces behind, the way men walk when they're thinking about witnesses and versions. In the kitchen, I set the thermos of soup on the counter like a peace offering from a neighboring country. You're welcome to wait here until the thaw, I said to him, because decency isn't a lever you throw for show. Or I can drive you home. I have a house, he said, affronted by the idea that he might need a ride. Not today, I said. You don't. He laughed once, all contempt, then caught himself and smiled. You're very sure of yourself for a man who couldn't buy a smoke alarm without help. Grace flinched. The heat that had risen in my chest back at the hardware store found me again and did not embarrass me this time. Do you know what love is? I said. It's buying the smoke alarm anyway. He rolled his eyes. Stoic poetry. Great. Grace stepped between us with that teacher's hand again. Open, calming, a human stop sign. Chase, enough. He looked at her then with an expression I recognized and did not like. The face of a man who thinks he's been betrayed by softness. You just let your father undermine you, he said. Do you want our children to learn that? That if Grandpa says no, we all cancel life? If life is a bridge with ice on it, she said, her voice steady, then yes. He stared at her as if she'd chosen a language he wouldn't learn on principle. So my parents will be disappointed, he said finally, a little boy under a man's coat. Then they'll survive, she said. We all will. He gathered his coat, made a small show of not needing help with the sleeve, and walked to the door. There he paused, one hand on the knob, and performed the line that told me everything. And cold teaches, he said. Remember that when you're deciding what kind of mother you want to be. There was a time for measured words. This was not it. And warmth saves, I said. Remember that when you're deciding whether to be a father at all. He left. The building closed itself around the absence like a stitched wound. We didn't cheer. We didn't cry. We made pancakes after all, because disaster averted still leaves a hole you have to fill with something kind. We ate them on the couch under one of the trunk blankets and watched a movie where no one drove anywhere dangerous because of a calendar. In the early afternoon, the power blinked once, flirted with drama, then stayed. Grace dozed with her head on my shoulder, the weight familiar, as if time didn't own us. At sunset, I took the thermos and the extra blanket back to the car and salted the steps again. In the lot, a neighbor on the second floor called down, "You got any extra?" I tossed the scoop up to him, and he salted his landing like a man who just remembered he had bones. When I came back in, Grace was sitting with her phone in both hands, her thumb hovering. "He texted," she said. She handed me the screen. It read, "You embarrassed me today. My folks asked where you were. I said, we don't cave to panic. Tomorrow 9. Jaos varo a.m. Wheels up. No excuses. Love you." She watched my face. "He writes love you like a trap door," she said. And the fine, sharp intelligence I'd seen in her since she was 5 stepped into the room and looked around at the decor. "Dad," she added, the question attached but not named. "Am I overreacting?" "You are reacting," I said. "To weather. To a sentence that looks like care and feels like a leash." I took my index card from my wallet and added the 8th note. 8. When you say no, watch whether he hears you or waits to talk again. "You already know the answer, Grace," I said. "I won't say it for you." She nodded. Her phone buzzed again. A new message. A different number. This one came from an unknown sender who didn't feel unknown. "Elaine Walker." It said, "We were so looking forward to meeting you, dear. Victor is very disappointed, but we understand your father has needs. We try to keep Chase on schedule. He thrives with structure. Tomorrow will be better. Do be brave." Grace handed me the phone like it was warm from some factory line that manufactures condescension. "Do be brave," she repeated, a laugh catching on the phrase and dying. Brave like driving on ice for roast chicken. "What if we were brave?" I said, and stayed. "Tomorrow?" she asked. "Tomorrow," I said. "We make soup. We shovel a neighbor's stairs. We watch the weather teach people who want to be taught." She breathed out. "And the day after?" "The day after," I said. "You decide whether a man who hears no as a dare should be invited to the rest of your life." She leaned into me again, and we let the evening sit without verdicts. Around 10. Gamiro. The radiators clinked to their tired winter hymn, and the building exhaled the way old buildings do when they've decided to keep you. I dozed, woke to the blue light of a snowplow somewhere far off, and dozed again. At 3. My phone chirped with a text I did not expect. "This is Osorio from Pine Home. Blankets received Tuesday. Thank you. Heads up, the road to the east entrance is a rink. We're calling in extra hands for morning turns. If you're awake and bored, we won't say no to a pot of coffee." I smiled in the dark. The world was full of people who asked for help at the right time with the right tone. I texted back, "On my way at 6 with coffee. Stay upright." And because I was more awake than asleep, I wrote one more line on the card, my hand steady in the shaky light. 9. Passive ends at the curb. If the house is safe, make another one safe. At 8. G0. Chase texted Grace again. "Where are you?" "We leave in 30. Grace typed. Erased. typed again. Then she sent, "I'm not going today. The roads are still bad. We can reschedule. Please stop." The 3 seconds before a reply are a country. His came fast. "Stop what?" She stared at the screen a long time. "He'll come here," she said. "Then he'll find pancakes," I said, "and a father he already thinks badly of." We made more batter. When the knock came at 9:15, it didn't sound like the day before. It sounded like a person asking for a witness. I opened the door to find Chase. Hair immaculate, jaw set, an apologetic smile stapled to the front of something harder. "I'm here to pick you up," he said to Grace, not entering because he was a man who followed rules when someone else could see. "I'm staying," she said. Her tone had learned overnight. He looked at me and found no leverage, so he pivoted to charm like a man switching cheeks. "Mr. Cole, I apologize if I was curt yesterday. My parents can be—" He searched for a word that would flatter his own criticism. "Ambitious." "They can be patient," I said. He chuckled as if I'd made a joke. "We'll be careful," he promised like a salesman guaranteeing the weather. Grace stepped closer to me. This was the midpoint. No fanfare, no gun smoke, just the exact half of a story where the person you love moves a foot in your direction while someone else talks about discipline. "No," she said simply. It's a small word that sounds like a door, and he heard it that way. He looked from her to me like a man checking exits. "Okay," he said at last softly. "Okay." He kissed her cheek, cold and rehearsed, then left in a way that advertised his ability to accept disappointment. I watched him from the window. He crossed the lot like a lesson, slid once, saved it, turned, and looked at the building as if it had failed a test. Then he got into his car and drove away slowly, as if that had been his idea all along. Grace let out a breath I suspect she'd been holding since the hardware store. She leaned her head against the glass. "Thank you," she said. "I keep that thank you for yourself," I said. "You did the hard part." "We did it," she countered. "We ate pancakes until the kitchen smelled like a better plan. Then I took the thermos and the blankets to Pine Home, because when you decide to be warm in a cold town, you don't stop at your own doorstep. Ms. Osorio met me at the door with that nod of hers that spends gratitude wisely. "We made it through the night," she said. "Morning will try us." "We'll try it back," I said, and poured coffee into a dozen hands that have earned every cup I'll ever carry. By afternoon, the sun chewed the edges off the ice, and you could hear the town begin again. Buses whispering, dogs remembering lawns, children testing forbidden puddles with one brave toe. I went home tired in the good way. At my mantel, Lillian's picture had collected a little dust from the morning's comings and goings. I wiped it gently with the corner of my sleeve. "Passive is over," I told her. She told me nothing and everything with the same smile. On my card, I drew a line under the 9th note and left a blank space beneath it. There would be time enough to fill it at a church and a reception hall, and in a room where 2 sets of parents try to decide what kind of weather they are. For now, the roads were thawing, and my daughter's car was parked. Sometimes that's the only miracle you need. The ice melted into memory, and the city dressed itself for company. By Friday, sidewalks flashed puddles that pretended not to be cold, and every lobby in Riverton smelled like starch and flowers. The rehearsal dinner was at Pinerist Grill because someone had decided rustic meant napkins tied with twine. Grace wore a blue dress Lillian would have liked, honest, unshowy, and she floated through the room like a person splitting herself into greetings. I hugged cousins I hadn't earned and shook hands with men who introduced themselves as operations, as if that were a first name. Elaine and Victor Walker arrived 24 minutes late, the kind of late that throws a leash over a room. The maitre d' pulled chairs as if the algorithm demanded it. Elaine kissed Grace's cheek and left the lipstick mark like a signature. "Traffic," she sang, even though traffic moves for some people the way curtains do. Victor's handshake was a resume. "Henry," he said, appraising me with a smile fitted by a jeweler. "At last." "Victor," I answered. "Welcome." It cost nothing to be polite, so I paid. They took the head table as if it were owed, a math problem solved by inheritance. Victor launched into a story about weathering Dutton's 8 as if it were a storm he captained away from rocks by will alone. Elaine made small sounds that affirmed genius. When a server spilled a single drop of wine near Victor's cuff, he said, "Attention to detail is free, pleasant as a hymn." Grace squeezed my hand under the table. "There you are." And I squeezed back. Still here. Across from us, Chase performed ease with his parents, the back of the hand touched to his mother's wrist, the deferential dad, the small, bright laugh that credits the joke to the right person. He was excellent at being a son, the way he was excellent at most things that show. I stood for a toast, not because I wanted to speak, but because silence can be mistaken for consent. "I'm Henry," I said, raising water. "Grace's father. I don't have the Walker's weather stories. My world was always the room I could heat, a table I could set, and the door I could open when the wind knocked harder than pride." I looked at my daughter, who had learned to be brave without mistaking it for cold. I'm grateful for everyone who loves my girl, and I'm grateful we're all here together long enough to practice it. It wasn't much. It was honest. People clinked. Somebody with a microphone tried to hand it to Victor. He declined with a princely flick. Tomorrow would be his stage. Later in the lobby, Elaine found Grace by the coats and held both her hands. I heard only the last sentence. "And be brave, dear." The same factory label she'd texted. Grace smiled the way daughters smile at mothers they don't want yet to call by their first names. When Elaine turned, she laid 2 fingers on my forearm, the way you touch a thermostat. "We're so glad to be folding her into structure," she said. "She already stands," I answered. "Structure optional." Her smile didn't move, but I saw there in the eyes the private calculation of a woman fleshing out a family budget with other people's temperatures. On my way out, I watched Victor tip the valet with a bill that made the kid's night while telling him, "Perfect. Kindly work on your posture." The boy straightened like a puppet pulled from heaven. Gratitude does funny things to a spine. Wedding day rose pale and warm for February. Sun on old stone like a kindness the church hadn't asked for. Saint. Luke smelled the way churches do. Wood that remembers hands, flowers that are trying their best, and dust that insists on being part of the liturgy. I arrived early with a paper bag of safety pins, mints, and a screwdriver because some emergencies don't need prayer so much as torque. In the bride's room, Grace stood in a half-circle of women, colleagues in dresses they'd never wear to school, while a friend threaded a veil to a comb with battlefield focus. Grace saw me in the mirror and smiled. That private smile that has been mine since she first discovered mirrors was on her face, bright against the white of the room and the tulle of the veil. "You look handsome," she said, her voice a calm harbor in the building storm. "Lillian's tie," I answered, touching the blue silk like a reliquary. It was the blue of honesty, I thought, and on a side table sat a neat manila folder that didn't belong at a wedding. I had seen too many of them not to know the scent of one. The tab read simply Covenant. Beside it, a fountain pen, a little too pleased with itself, rested on a leather portfolio. I glanced. I didn't touch. Chase breezed in moments later with a cluster of groomsmen who smelled of cologne and good intentions. He kissed Grace on the temple without touching her hair, his movements economical, clean. Points complemented the veil, he murmured, pulling back. Details matter. And then, with a host's ease, he planted 2 documents on the vanity like hors d'oeuvres. Shh, quick logistics, he said, his voice low, a man handling nonsense on behalf of a bride. Insurance rider for the venue. Boilerplate, I promise. And a short family covenant my parents like everyone to sign. Expectations, emergency plans, that kind of thing. Makes holidays smoother. Not today, I said, almost conversationally, the quiet tone cutting through the cologne and the cheer. Before Grace could reach for them, he smiled at me the way patient men smile at men they plan to outlast. It's truly 5 seconds. Henry. Just a formality. I met Grace's eyes in the mirror. Sign nothing big on a big day, I said. That's not law. It's weather sense. She laughed, grateful for a rule that didn't require a fight. Rain check, she told him gently. I'll read it after. The only thing I'm signing today is my name on a license. He didn't push. He adjusted. He slid the papers under the portfolio with a movement that told me he'd planned 3 ways for this to go, and we'd selected route B. Later is fine, he said, and kissed her hand in a way that made the room sigh on schedule. He left. The bridesmaids exhaled the breath they'd been holding since the word covenant had been mentioned. I took a small screwdriver from my pocket and knitted the back of a small, loose button on her dress, and the room loved me an extra inch for the small, solvable task. When we were alone again, Grace touched the folder. Is it awful, Dad? She said softly, that the word covenant doesn't feel like love to me. It sounds like the opposite of a story, I said. It sounds like a rule that assumes love will fail. She nodded. We didn't have time to unpack the theology. The coordinator, tiny, merciless, holy, clapped her hands. 30 minutes. People, she said. Hydrate or perish. Down the hall, the walkers made an entrance as if the sun were late to their morning. Elaine's dress whispered, money. Victor's cufflinks flashed rivulets of light like expensive snow. The groom's side gathered itself around them the way iron gathers to a magnet. When the coordinator asked them to move inside for photos, Victor smiled at her with the apex of courtesy and did nothing at all. Mr. Walker, she said a half-beat later, the same tone, but with a thread of steel beneath it. We're lining up. Of course, he said, moving without moving. And then he did. Because even people who believe they make the weather respect a woman with a clipboard. 5 minutes before vows, I stepped into the sacristy to breathe. The room held the chill 1,000 candles couldn't vanish. Through the cracked door, I heard the staticky babble of a crowd, ready to witness something they could discuss in the car later. On a table rested a set of old rings used for classes and ceremonies, heavy as promises made in a century that didn't know us. The door eased wider, and a boy in a miniature suit toddled in, powerfully small. He was 6, maybe, with a shoelace looped and praying to hold, clutching a velvet pillow like a life preserver. Bathroom, he whispered to the room, which is how children ask for help, apologizing to the air. Left, then left, I said. He didn't move. His knees knocked once, a tiny metronome. Want company? I asked. He nodded without giving me the dignity of language, so I walked him to the door. In the hall, a woman, not his mother, a cousin with too much mascara and a timeline in her phone, hissed, "You're late! Eli!" then knelt to retie his laces with the fury of people embarrassed on a schedule. Chase arrived mid-knot. "Bud," he said cheerfully. "Remember what we practiced? No mistakes, right? You can do it." Eli nodded so hard his hair moved. The lace slipped again because hands are traitors. He started to cry in the dusty, choking way boys do when the world is telling them they're interrupting a production number. "It's okay," I said, crouching. "Shoes are liars. Happens to everyone." Chase's smile tightened one half-turn. He took the pillow from Eli and then, fast, neat, controlled, took the boy's wrist in the same 2 fingers he used for pulses and steering. He pressed just that pressure point and said, "Soft enough for the hall, but not for me." He followed it with a soft, swift command. "Hey, control. Okay, we go in 3. His grip wasn't cruel. It was efficient. It said, "I will direct your body until your soul catches up." Eli froze like prey does. His knuckles went pale where my daughter's would someday rest if she kept walking toward the aisle. Memory had its say in me then. The nursing home. Mr. King's hand moved from the night. The hardware store. Grace's wallet intercepted. The parking lot. A wrist that thought it was a lever. I looked up, and in the tiny, convex mirror of a fire extinguisher, I saw Grace behind us, unseen. She had come early, veil in hand, to ask me to walk her. She saw that hand on Eli. She saw the demonstration given by a man who calls control kindness. There was no speech. There was not even a word. It was what story people call the recognition, the map suddenly becoming the territory. She didn't make a scene. She stood very still, then stepped back like a deer who has decided the path where she stands is not a path after all. I stood. Chase released the boy, patted his shoulder. "We've got this." Champ handed him off to the mascara cousin, and turned to find me between him and the room like an inconvenient piece of furniture. "Everything okay?" he said, the pleasant actor again. "Shoes," I said. A menace. He smiled. "We'll start in 1. I went to the bride's room because that is where I was supposed to be. Grace stood at the mirror with her veil in her hands, like a net she wasn't sure she wanted to wear. Behind her, the manila folder waited under its portfolio like a snake napping under a hat. "You saw?" I said gently. She nodded. "I saw what I already knew how to see." Her voice didn't tremble. Her hands did. I thought he stopped. It doesn't matter what I thought. "I see." I put my palm on the place where Lillian used to rest hers when words needed a place to land. "We can do anything," I said. "We can go out there and you can marry him and we will love you through whatever math those days become. Or we can walk out the side door and I'll carry your shoes. None of it will change the fact that I am yours and you are mine. Today doesn't scare me. Losing you does." Grace closed her eyes and then opened them with the decision already in them. She folded the veil in half, then in half again, then laid it on the chair like a soft surrender to a different battle. "I want to go home," she said. "Okay," I said. We told the coordinator first because she deserved the respect. Her eyes widened for 1 second and then narrowed into logistics. "Give me 5 minutes," she said, already moving, already shielding. "You two stay put. If you must leave, take the north stairwell. But I'd rather we say it in the room once." "We?" Grace asked. "It'll be my voice if you want it," the coordinator said. "But yours will be better." We waited in the little white box of a room that now had too much air in it. Voices swelled in the nave, music testing itself, whispers finding the pitch of rumor. The world loves a story. It loves a collision more. Then the door opened, and Elaine entered without knocking, as if she were the owner of all doors. Her smile was a mirror people check just before they step on stage. "Darling," she said, "we're beginning." She saw the folded veil and faltered half a beat. "Is something wrong with the comb? We can fix it." Grace looked at her future mother-in-law as if seeing a woman she could be in 30 years if she kept choosing the same sentence. "I'm not going out there," she said evenly. Elaine's smile became a tool. "Nerves are natural," she said. "Be brave." Grace's laugh had no humor in it. "I'm done being brave about the wrong things." Elaine shifted to flanking fire. "My guests are seated," she said as if that were a sacrament. "Victor's associates flew in from—" "I'm not going out there," Grace repeated. Elaine turned her eyes to me the way a person turns to a camera when they want their good side recorded. "Mr. Cole," she said, soft with judgment. "This is the moment when a father does not indulge." "Elaine," I said, gentler than I felt. "This is the moment when a mother chooses to be a mother or an event planner. One of those jobs can be rehired." She stared at me long enough to decide I wasn't useful, then left because the room she wanted to control was bigger. 2 minutes later, we were standing at the front of St. Luke's, not in satin, but in ourselves. The coordinator had hushed the musicians, closed the side doors, and turned the body of the church toward us with a dignity that made the pews look like a jury. Chase came down the aisle with his father's hand on his shoulder, a tableau of disappointed men. He looked at Grace. He assessed. He painted on a face labeled hurt but magnanimous. The pastor, poor soul, opened his book to a blank page and took a breath. Grace beat him to it. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice steady, carrying the true teacher. "There won't be a wedding today." The words did the thing words do when they are simple and true. They changed the weather. You could feel air leave lungs. You could hear jewelers' clasps falter. You could watch men take out phones because that's what some men do when the sky goes red. Chase raised both palms in the diplomacy of crisis. "We're having a private moment," he announced to the room. "Please give us—" "No," Grace said without looking at him. "I'm not marrying you." Even then, God help him, he moved to control the scene. He leaned in, his voice for her ear. "You're overreacting," he whispered. "We can practice. Momentum matters." "Stop," she said. "Oh, please stop." He reached for her wrist, those 2 fingers he'd used to instruct a child, half the pressure he'd used in the hall. My body moved before my mind voted. I slid a hand between his and my daughter's skin with the old carpenter's trick, touched one tendon and opened a hinge. The sound the room made then was not gasping. It was recognizing a map they'd all traveled without reading the legend. The shockwave of the truth hit Chase fully then, but instead of acceptance, it triggered the final stage of his control mechanism. He pulled his hand back quickly, staring at the contact point as if I had burned him. His voice rose, sharp and ugly, cutting through the church's sacred silence. "You did this, Henry. You convinced her. You've been undermining me since the first day." The accusation was a relief, a sign that the persona had fully cracked. "I'm tired of your pathetic need for attention. This celebration is only for important people," he yelled, looking at the horrified guests, turning to a member of the church security team standing by the door. "Take this beggar, this annoying colleague, and get him as far away as possible." He pointed at me, his finger trembling with exposed fury. The security guard, a polite young man named Mike, looked from Chase to me, confusion clouding his face. "Sir, do it!" Chase shrieked, the sound echoing off the rafters. It was a complete capitulation to the theatrical, all the carefully constructed charm dissolving into a spoiled man demanding order. At that moment, I saw Victor Walker turn from the front row. He moved with a speed that belied his age, his face not angry, but something much colder, pure, financial shock. He reached Chase in 3 strides and pulled him back by the arm, speaking in a harsh whisper that was all the more terrifying for its lack of volume. Victor then turned and shouted, loud enough for the entire church to hear, "It can't be. Is it really you? Henry Cole?" He walked toward me, his hand extended, the resume of his handshake now replaced with a frantic, forced camaraderie. "If you're watching this video, tell me where you're from or what time it is for you." He trailed off, realizing he was speaking to a crowd of people, not a camera. He adjusted, quickly switching to a professional tone only I could hear. "Henry, I didn't recognize you. The tie. It's been years. We have to talk about the Riverton Arts Fund funding. We need to catch up." He took my arm, his grip surprisingly strong, trying to pull me away from the front of the church. The sudden mention of a local, low-key charity, a client of mine from years ago, a project I'd quietly overseen, was a last-ditch attempt at damage control. He was trying to signal to Chase and Elaine that I was not a simple embarrassment, but a man of connections, a potential partner or threat. Grace stood like a statue, watching the men in her life perform their final, messy dance of crisis management. Chase tried to pull away from his father, his face white with incomprehension. "Dad, what are you doing?" "Silence!" Victor hissed back, his eyes fixed on me. "Henry, your tie is impeccable. The tie belongs to a man who understood the weather," I told him. Grace stepped forward, past her father and her former fiancé, interrupting the frantic, whispered negotiation. "Victor, thank you," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. "But there's no need to catch up. I'm done with this. This wedding is canceled." She did not leave the room. She walked down the aisle, her head high, the blue dress flowing. She paused halfway and turned back to face the sanctuary. The crowd was silent, every phone in the room lowered. She looked at her father, who was still trying to keep Chase quiet, then at Elaine, who had finally rushed down the aisle, her face a mask of social ruin. "I apologize for the inconvenience," Grace said, the teacher in her taking over, speaking to the entire room. "Please enjoy the brunch we planned for the reception hall. It's a wonderful spread. Thank you for coming." It was the dismissal of a kind person, turning a collision into a catering note. She then walked out the main doors, exiting the story in her own way, on her own terms. I watched her go, a small, fierce pride warming my chest. Chase made a move to follow her, but Victor held him back. I turned, not toward the back doors, but toward the side door of the sacristy where I had left my coat. I collected my Lillian tie, my jacket, and the small paper bag with the screwdriver, safety pins, and mints. As I reached the door, Elaine found me. "You sabotaged this," she accused, her voice low, trembling with a controlled rage that was far more frightening than Chase's outburst. "You are responsible for this ruin." "I am responsible for my daughter," I said, looking not at her face, but past her, toward the empty aisle. "The ruin was always inside the building. Elaine, I just held the door open so she could see it." I left, walking out the side door into the bright, cold February air. The wedding party was frozen on the steps, a tableau of expensive misery. I got into my old pickup and drove, not toward my home, but toward the reception hall. You don't leave people with a disaster. You leave them with logistics. I spent the next 2 hours talking to the caterer, the florist, and the Pinerist grill manager. I paid for the brunch in full. The whole Walker side of the family and their associates could eat their ambition, and ensured the flowers were delivered to Pine Home. I instructed the manager to pack up the 2 wedding cakes, one for the church staff and the second for Ms. Osorio's residence. I carried folding chairs back into the storage closet and untied the twine from the rustic napkins. When I had done all I could to make the day merely an expensive brunch instead of a public trauma, I drove to Grace's apartment. She was already there, out of the dress and into sweats, making tea. She looked tired, but the crease that had been between her brows since the hardware store was gone. She smiled, a genuine, quiet smile. "It's over, Dad," she said. "I'm tired and happy. We will work. We will work." 4 words that sound like a bell rung right. I walked out to the porch, a mug of tea in my hand. The maple was parked at its evening gray. Hoses and chalk drawings and a radio 2 houses over that couldn't decide on a station. I thought about maps and doors and all the hands that tried to direct a day that needed only one true thing. A father where a daughter expected him. If I had failed, I would have lost her to a world that thinks belonging is a room with a list. I did not fail. I didn't win either, not like men write about winning. I did something better. I showed up the whole way, kept my voice clean, and became the piece of floor my kid could step onto without looking. After the music stops, you carry chairs and tie knots you can live with. You put cake in boxes and promises in drawers. You go back to ordinary days with something truer in your pocket than any program could print. That's enough. That was always enough. Victor stepped forward like a lawyer approaching a podium. "Henry," he said, the name an objection. "Let's manage this away from witnesses." "No, thank you," I answered, calm without effort. Chase looked out at the faces, searching for a sign that he could still win the optics. "We've had a misunderstanding," he said to the crowd. "Love is not a schedule," Grace said so cleanly. The pastor actually closed his book. She looked at the ring bearer, poor Eli with his newly conquered laces, then at Ms. Coordinator with her clipboard, then at me. "Love is warmth that doesn't flinch," she said. "And I won't spend my life learning how to be cold to make other people comfortable." Silence. Then from somewhere in the back, where the folding chairs live, a single clear voice. "Amen." It was not a churchy amen. It sounded like a nurse who'd worked a night shift and was done being polite to a man who thought she was furniture. When I turned, I saw Ms. Osorio leaning in the doorway in her off-duty sweater, her eyes bright. She must have come with one of the residents' daughters, or maybe the world had simply arranged mercy in the shape of a person who tells the truth. It didn't become a scene beyond that. The coordinator, elevated to a saint in my private calendar, stepped up, thanked people for their time, invited them to the hall for food that had already been paid for, and told them with authority that they were not to seek explanations from the bride. Then she looked at me. "North stairwell," she mouthed. "Shoes optional." We left by that narrow side, not as fugitives, but as 2 people choosing a smaller room. The winter light outside was brighter than it had any right to be. The parking lot smelled like cold and car exhaust, and a bakery 2 streets over trying to keep up with Saturday. We walked to the Buick without speaking, because sometimes speech reduces a thing that deserves to stay wide. I opened the passenger door. Grace climbed in, then reached out and took my hand. "I'm sorry," she said. "Not for him, not for the guests, not for the money Irene from catering had already earned, but for the weight a daughter is taught to carry when she disappoints the script." "For what?" I asked. For thinking I had to be brave about a kind of cold that only teaches itself, she said. She smiled, raw and fierce. Let's go home. We drove the long way, because the long way isn't about distance. It's about letting the shock metabolize without a show. On Cedar Lane, the old maple out front flickered last summer's leaves in a way only my house could hear. Inside, I made tea that tasted like every winter we'd survived. We sat at the table that had learned us, and I called St. Luke's to make sure the caterer fed everyone anyway, because kindness wasn't a casualty of the day. While the water boiled, I took my index card from my wallet and wrote the 10th and final note. 10. Truth doesn't need a speech when a daughter says no. Then I tore the card in half because the list had done its job. The rest would be living. My phone buzzed itself across the table. A text from an unknown number introduced itself with a tone. Victor, we will send a car to collect the ring and the gifts delivered to your residence. Kindly be available. I stared at the words the way you stare at a treadmill trying to sell you scenery. Then I typed, the ring will be returned by mail. The gifts will be forwarded at our expense to a shelter of Grace's choosing. Kindly be well. He did not text back. Elaine did 80 seconds later. I regret your influence. Chase is heartbroken. Structure would have helped. I didn't answer, because sometimes silence is the only warm thing you can give to a person who thinks cold is a curriculum. Grace and I ate soup in the quiet we'd earned. Afterward, I drove to Pine Home with 2 trays of food that would outlast anyone's appetite for spectacle. Ms. Osorio met me at the door with that specific nod of gratitude that never becomes debt. Big morning? She asked, eyes quick. Bigger than necessary, I said. She took the trays. We'll turn it into calories, she said. Best magic there is. Before I left, I looked in on Mr. King. He was dozing, hands at peace on the blanket, dignity intact. The knight sat on his windowsill, a sentinel. I set one cookie beside it because sometimes love is sugar you didn't ask for. At home, dusk crept the way it always had, indifferent to our dramas. Grace fell asleep on the couch with a book open on her chest, and her hair trying to be a veil without rules. I covered her with a blanket that remembered Lillian and stood there a long time, the old furnace humming, the house affirming what the day had said out loud. Tomorrow would bring versions. There would be calls and postings and a world that believes it is owed a narrative. Let it in the one that mattered. My daughter had stepped toward warmth and left a room that worships winter to worship it without her. I poured tea for 2 and set 1 cup by her hand. Then I sat and watched the windows turn the color of forgiveness. We had not won a war. We had simply not started one. Sometimes that's the bravest thing you can do. I met my grandson under a wash of hospital light, that soft, unearned glow that makes even old hands look steady. Grace slept, hair wild, her face slack with the relief that follows fear, and a nurse rolled the bassinet close until the baby's breath sounded like a clock you'd never want to wind. He's perfect, the nurse said, because that's what nurses say when they mean it. He held my finger with the insistence of a creature who doesn't know anything about schedules or covenants or the weather other people try to make. I stood there, anchored to 3 pounds of proof that warmth wins more fights than it gets credit for. We didn't make that day about anyone else. There was a father, kind, deliberate, the sort of man who uses his hands for shelter before he uses them for emphasis. But we let the room belong to the baby and the mother who had decided months earlier that bravery wasn't a synonym for cold. Names came later. For the afternoon, he was simply ours, a small weight on a planet that keeps orbiting whether or not it learns. When the nurse slipped out, I took the rocker in the corner and let the chair and the boy teach me their rhythm. Through the glass, snow fattened the air in lazy diagonals. My index card was still in my wallet, though most of its work had been done the day Grace said no into a microphone and saved a life before she'd made one. I took it out, read the lines that had carried us through a winter that pretended to be a curriculum, then tucked it into the back of the bassinet like a talisman the baby couldn't read and didn't need to. Some lessons you keep, some you compost. After the day at St. Luke's, the world did what it always does when it smells story. It asked for a different ending. There were messages, long and short. Elaine sent 3 versions of the same sentence, all of them concluding with, "Be brave." Victor wrote once, decorous and oblique, suggesting a generous settlement of logistics, by which he meant the ring, the gifts, and a ledger of costs that made love look expensive. We returned the ring, insured, with a note that said, "Nothing poetic, just dates received and shipped, and a tracking number that could withstand a courtroom." We sent the gifts to a women's shelter with a card signed by Grace and a dozen teachers who had spent their own money on classroom glue. St. Luke's received a check for the reception hall and turned it into casseroles for people whose disasters didn't come with centerpieces. I kept copies of everything and wrote on the folder, "Walker Public, closed." The only letter I didn't file was the one I drafted and didn't send. It was addressed to a reporter I knew in the way men my age know who reads the court notices. In it, I'd pasted the public pages I'd pulled at the county recorder. Acquisitions, pressured narratives, a settlement that had disappeared under a seal. I had written a tasteful note about patterns and weather, and the way discipline can be used to excuse cruelty with a neat hand. Halfway through, I stopped. The truth I was tempted to tell would have been tidy. It would not have been merciful. I was not afraid of vengeance. I was unwilling to make it a hobby. Instead, I put the folder in the safe beside Lillian's necklace, not as a threat, but as an umbrella. If anyone ever pointed cold at my daughter again, I'd know where to reach. In the meantime, I invested my anger like money I wanted to see do some good. I took blankets and lotion to Pine Home until Ms. Osorio stopped pretending to be surprised. We made a little fund with a name that embarrassed us both. Warm hands, warm rooms, seated by the unused centerpiece budget and matched by quiet checks from people who had believed Grace at St. Luke's and decided belief should come with a receipt. The high school kid traded his stickered guitar for an old upright that a church was retiring, and music hour became something that could lift even a stubborn Tuesday. Mr. King died in May. He went while the lilacs were bossing the sidewalks. Quiet, not alone. The last time I saw him, he had the night on his windowsill and a hymn in his throat he didn't have to finish. We put the chest piece in his pocket because sometimes a man deserves to carry the thing he learned how to hold. I took the long way home from the funeral and stopped at the hardware store. Tony had graduated to a name tag that said, "Manager" on a ribbon someone had bedazzled when no one was looking. We laughed about the smoke alarm that taught me something I didn't need to learn. And I bought 3 more for the house, for Grace's apartment, and for a friend of Ms. Osorio's whose nephew liked to cook and forget. $40 felt like a tithe I owed to a God I could actually serve. Grace set boundaries I didn't have to enforce. She blocked numbers not out of spite, but out of the knowledge that silence can be a kind of sermon. When an embossed card arrived in June announcing a Walker Foundation gala to benefit resilience initiatives, she scissored it into a stack of gift tags and used them at Christmas. "Recycled resilience," she said, deadpan, and I laughed the good kind of old man laugh, the one that leaves room for youth to echo back. Summer softened us. We learned that errands shared are better than grand gestures. We made soup for neighbors without posting about it. Grace went back to teaching in August with a new chair that didn't punish her back and a rule on the wall that read, warmth first, boundaries second, consequences third, never the other way around. Her students called her Miss Cole until they got the hang of the new name she would take later. And even then, half of them forgot because children are terrible record keepers and excellent judges of weather. Once in the grocery store a month after St. Luke's, I ran into Chase. It was the wrong aisle for a reunion, paper goods, a fluorescent tunnel of boring. And for a second, we were two men choosing napkins while a country's worth of unspoken things tried to climb out of our jackets. He nodded. Civil. I nodded back. Same. He started to speak, then thought better of it. Or maybe he weighed the sentence he'd packed for me and found it off balance on the cart. He left with a package of something biodegradable, his face looking like it had practiced letting go without mastering it. I felt no triumph. Winter leaving is not a victory. It's a season minding its business. In October, a nurse at Pine Home taped a photo to the bulletin board. Mr. King at his last bingo, the night on the towel, Ms. Osorio in the background doing 5 things under it. Thank you, Henry and friends. I tried to peel my name off. She smacked my hand away. Let people thank the right person once in a while, she said. It won't kill you. I have evidence to the contrary, I answered. But I'll try. When the baby came, Winter had already put one finger on the town's shoulder and said, soon. The morning before, I'd fixed the old draft by the back door, a bead of caulk, a thin rope of weather stripping, and had the self-satisfaction of a man who wins small fights against entropy. In the delivery room, the doctor said words I didn't hear because my daughter was in the kind of pain that makes fathers believe in exchanging their lungs for someone else's. When the cry arrived, it sounded like hope relearning itself. In the nursery, I stood with a paper bracelet on my wrist that called me what I'd finally earned. Grandparent. The boy frowned like he was already parsing an index card. The father, kind man, steady, stood beside me, and we practiced the quiet that only men in rooms like this practice. Grateful without theater, humbled without apology. Later, there would be names. There would be a ceremony with cake made by hands that had iced more birthdays than weddings. There would be a high chair and a drawer that held nothing but washcloths and a carpet the color of spilled oatmeal. The world would fill with tiny objects that never returned to the same place twice. For the afternoon, there was a rocking chair, a window, and a small person who had never seen snow. Do you want him? The nurse asked. I already do, I said, and she laughed because fathers say corny things when they've survived winter. He weighed less than my old tool bag. He weighed more than every case I'd built against the cold. I held him and told him a story not about weather but about roofs. This house keeps you, I said under my breath. Not because babies understand English, but because grandfathers need to hear themselves promise it. Inside these walls, warmth first, boundaries second, consequences third. You won't learn discipline disguised as love. You'll learn love with a backbone. I didn't mention the walkers. He wouldn't need that map. By the time he was choosing his own roads, the file in my safe would be brittle and irrelevant. If the world tried to teach him that control was care, we'd show him the difference with biscuits and repaired doorknobs and the kind of calm that doesn't have to raise its voice to become a climate. We went home 2 days later to a house that smelled like history and laundry. I installed the new smoke alarm in the hall and let it chirp once so the baby would learn early that some warnings are for protection, not panic. Grace slept in her old room with the baby on her chest, and a sign on the door scribbled by me that said, "Do not knock unless the house is on fire." And even then, think it through. In the evenings, I walked the baby around the living room and gave him tours of objects that had kept us alive. Lillian's clock, the pot roast pan that had broken and mended us in equal measure, the adjustable wrench that knew every trick a carpenter's thumb did. "This is a knight," I told him one night, holding up the carved horse I'd taken home from Pine Home's donations the week we turned the activity room into a chess club. "It moves in an L, which is a funny way to move. You'll hear a lot about straight lines. Don't believe all of it." Grace would wake, listen, laugh at our lectures that sounded like love letters, then drift back into the kind of sleep that belongs to people who've done brave things without clapping for themselves. Sometimes she'd stand in the kitchen at 2. What, M? Hair in a pile, baby in the crook of an elbow, and we'd eat toast over the sink like a sacrament that required crumbs. Once she said, "I keep waiting to feel guilty." "For what?" I asked. "For not being brave in the way they wanted." She said, "You were brave in the way you needed," I answered. "That counts in rooms where weather isn't for show." In January, a card came from Elaine. The handwriting was smaller, the paper thicker. It said, "We hear your news. We wish you health. Perhaps one day we can meet the child and start again with structure." Grace read it, smiled without malice, and put it in a drawer with warranty cards. "Maybe one day," she said, "when structure means nap schedules and smoke alarms." We didn't reply. Mercy sometimes looks like not returning a volley. I kept volunteering at Pine Home because the place had taught me more about climates than men with portfolios ever could. Ms. Osorio let me run chess and stories on Thursdays if I promised to lose convincingly. I brought the baby once in March, and every hand that touched him did so with a miracle's restraint. "You're doing fine," one woman told him. "Keep your socks on." He tried and failed. We clapped anyway. On the first warm day of April, I took down the storm windows and opened the house. Air moved through rooms that had earned it. Grace sat on the porch with the baby and a book she wasn't reading. And we watched neighborhood kids negotiate puddles with a seriousness that would have made Chase compose a lesson and would have made Victor dictate one. We offered neither. We put a bowl of chalk on the steps and a rag for wiping knees, and the block governed itself by the oldest law there is: pay attention to the small people first. That night, I found the index card again behind the soup cans. I'd meant to throw it away at the hospital and hadn't. I read the 10 notes and felt gratitude for the man who'd written them while he was scared. I kept number 9, passive ends at the curb, and threw the others in the compost in the garden under the maple that had seen us through. I turned the soil with my hands until old paper became food for tomatoes I'd try and fail to grow straight. Summer will come. Winter will return. The boy will learn to walk and then to argue. The world will try to teach him that momentum matters more than mercy. We'll show him another lesson. When he reaches for a night and knocks it over, we'll put a towel under the board and let him try again. When he cries because a shoe betrays him, we'll tie it slower than is efficient. When someone calls control love, we'll open a hinge with one finger and make a room where warmth doesn't flinch. On the mantel, Lillian's photograph kept smiling, unchanged by seasons. I set a newer one beside it. Grace on the porch with a baby asleep against her. A blanket tucked the way my late wife used to tuck every soft thing in our house. The furnace clicked, a memory of winter choosing not to speak. Outside, the town practiced evening. I put water on for tea and cut 2 slices of bread because habits are the only liturgy I trust. The house hummed with the small noises of people who are safe. I could have called that a happy ending. I preferred to call it a warm beginning.